Hello, welcome to my video, and here I'm going to show you three endgames. The first one is this one from the game played between Magnus Carlsen and Erik Hansen from a Meltwater Championship, and we have this position. Knight against bishop, white has an extra pawn, but still there are some difficulties to convert this, because all the pawns are on the dark squares on the king side, and the king cannot really easily support the c-pawn. So black goes with king f7 first, knight d7, and now bishop d6 by black, defending this pawn. And now c5 doesn't work. It looks good because you just push the pawn and you don't care about the thing, but after king e6, and now the knight is under attack, and also the c-pawn is still attacked, so white has to go c6, but after this the c-pawn is doomed. And if white tries something like knight f6, then after this, knight h7, white took a pawn, but after bishop b7, the knight cannot participate into the play, and if you go here, then black takes and goes e4. And this endgame is supposed to be a draw. So after bishop d6, Magnus went for king f3. Now black tries to activate his king e6, and now knight b6 back. And now Hansen plays a really nice move, e4, trying to fix all these pawns on the dark squares to keep them a potential target for the bishop. And now Magnus goes to e2, and he tries to get to the queen side, but it's not so easy to do that, because the bishop can always get something like bishop b4, bishop e1, and target f2 if the king goes too far. Now bishop e5 by Hansen, knight a4, king d6, trying to keep the c-pawn, king d2, king c6, and now king c2. So far so good for white. There's no danger of this and bishop e1. Black has to make some other maneuver, and that's exactly what black does. He goes bishop c7, trying to get to a5 and e1, and this signals to Magnus that he needs to go back to d1, that he has to find a plan B. He goes back to e5, and now king e2. Now the plan B could be to push f3 at some point and to try to somehow undermine those pawns in the center and on the king side. He just shuffles around, and now king goes to f1. He's keeping this bishop on this diagonal because he wants to keep pressure on g3. So the f3 move is not available. And bishop e5 back, king h2, and now h5, stopping ideas like g4 at some point. King h3, g4, and to open up this way. Now he goes back to f1, bishop c7, king e2, bishop a5, and king d1, bishop b4. They don't. White doesn't make much progress here. He just shuffles around to get some time, and now he plays f3. Finally he gets some progress, but now Hansen just plays bishop c7, and I think that here it was much better to go king f2 to defend the pawn on g3, and then to do the same thing. But even that wouldn't promise too much, because you can take and go bishop e5, and what's happening here actually? The king cannot advance too much, and also the g3 pawn is always quite weak and needs babysitting all the time. So Magnus chose to take immediately on e4, even though king f2 was slightly better, but still nothing too promising. And now Hansen played fe, but he could have taken on g3 here, and after e takes, g takes, also the h4 pawn drops, and I think black could make a draw quite easily here. After king f3, bishop h4, king f4, and now bishop f2, the h pawn is enough counterplay against white. E3 pawn is also weak. If the knight moves, then king can just advance and pick up the c pawn. So I feel like this is a much safer way of securing a draw. But even fe4 in this position was actually fine. King f2 and now bishop e5. Now the knight cannot get out of this prison. It cannot jump to any of these squares. King g2 by Magnus, and now bishop f6. Now Hansen just tries to keep this bishop on this diagonal to stop the knight to escape to c3 or b2. King h3 by white, and now bishop g7. After which Magnus plays g4. Tries to provoke this. But even in that case, bishop h6 is a fairly easy draw, because after knight c3, let's say, to capture the pawn, takes, bishop h6. The bishop very nicely holds the king to get to g5, and the knight is stuck to securing the pawn, because if the knight moves, then king c5 goes next, and it's not so pleasant. But he chose this move instead, and now g5 by Magnus. Hansen just shuffles his bishop, king g3, and now to stop king f4, of course, he gives a check. And now king f2 by white, bishop g7, king e2, and now king d6. This move is a bit stranger. I think bishop e5 is much simpler, and after this to go bishop g3, but maybe Hansen was afraid of this and capturing on e4 and making this bishop more passive. But actually there's no way to trap this bishop, and black can just continue with king d7, king c3, and now king e6. After which, if you go here, then bishop e1 can be played, and with h4 next, this is supposed to be a draw. Quite most likely a draw. But he went for king d6, and this allowed the knight to jump, and when the knight starts jumping around, it's never so pleasant. And here black makes a huge mistake, which costs him a game, and he plays king c5 here. Here bishop e5 was better, and it would force white to go back to f2, after which you can go to e6, and after c5 to go bishop c7. And here we have some kind of stalemate position. Nobody can move anything. The king is stuck to defending against bishop g3. The knight defends against entries on d7 or d5, and it's not easy for white to make any progress. Black can just wait here on d8 and wait for the knight to move, and then enter with king d5. So after knight b6, king c5, now it's a problem, because now there is this move, and after king c4, knight f4. The g6 pawn becomes a target, bishop e5, knight g6, and after bishop g3, which was black's hope, now there is knight f4, and the g pawn will begin running, and the king is too far from the action, because first it has to go around, and second of all, the knight can also support the g pawn. And Hansen tried capturing, but after g6, bishop f6, knight h5, black is just losing the bishop, and in this position black resigned because there's no defense against g7 and losing the bishop. The second one is this one from the same tournament between Liren and Magnus Carlsen. And now Magnus was on the different side. He was defending the endgame, as you can see, because of this h-pawn, which is quite dangerous, and also the better placed king. The king is quite passive on e8, and the rook on b7 dictates all the things in the position. Black has some counter chances in view of the c-pawn, but white should be able to control that. And now Ding plays g4 in this position, and Magnus tries to push the c-pawn as far as possible and to generate some counterplay with the help of this c-pawn. But now Ding just plays g5, doesn't do much about the c-pawn, although it was better to go for rook b6 here, trying to go rook c6 on the next move. And if black tries to push the pawn, then this is a very good move. And after capturing and going c3, you can just go back to d3, and after c2 to go king e3. And not king e2 because of bishop f4 and promoting on the next move, but to play king e3 and then threaten to go king d2 next. And after bishop c3 to go knight c1, and eventually the pawn c2 becomes capturable, and after a couple of more moves, I think this is just dead lost for black, because the king is in a cage, the bishop is stuck to defending the h-pawn, and the king can just freely go to d3, e4, d5, just get closer anywhere, even to d5 or f5, and then start pushing the g-pawn and slowly suffocating black. And that's why rook b6 was better than g5. g5 is also good, but it allows Magnus to push the pawn immediately, but Ding finds a really nice counterplay against this c-pawn, and he plays g6, takes, and now king f8, because you have to defend against g7. Now the knight goes to e6 and king g8 by black. White's position on that side of the board where the king is looks really promising, but the queen side is a bit critical because the c-pawn is very, very advanced and it might give some trouble to white. So now Ding has to take care of this pawn and somehow block it. Magnus pushes the pawn, and now king d1. And apparently black cannot do anything about, in case of c2, to go king c1, and it's impressive how the knight just controls all the squares where the bishop can give a check. But actually this was the best choice that Magnus had, and then to play a5. But even in that case, Ding could have played rook b6, and after king h8, rook c6. And let's say rook g8, king c2, take on g6, rook c8, rook g8, because after this there is a fork. So this, you can take and go king d3, and maybe this is holdable for black, but in a practical game I think it's nearly impossible to do that. But in the game, Magnus played first a5, and this was a bad move because it allowed king c2. And now the king blocks the pawn without much trouble, because if you compare c2, king c1, there was always some threat of going bishop f4 if the knight moves and white doesn't have free hands like in this case. In this case, the pawn is 2 squares from promotion and he only needs to just put the rook to c file and then to march with the king. And now rook a8 was played by Magnus, and now rook b5. And now black is completely paralyzed and he has to move either the bishop or the king. And he chose to move the bishop, rook b6, bishop e5, and now rook b7. And now if the rook moves to c8, there is rook a7 and the a pawn drops. So Magnus chose to play bishop f6. But now there is this. Black allows rook c7, and after bishop b5, now the king is free to go to the other side. And that's what Ding does. King d3, bishop f6, king e4, and notice how the king is completely paralyzed. The rook has to stay on the 8th rank because of potential back rank issues. The knight dominates the whole position. The pawn on g6 is also covering all the important squares. f7, h7, and the knight on e6 controls g7, so practically speaking, the king is in a cage. So black just waits here. King f5, rook b8, king g5, rook a8, and now king h6. Finally, the king comes to the h6, and after rook e8, he goes g7, and in this position, Magnus resigned, because if he keeps shuffling with the rook as before, then king g6 comes with rook f7 next, and then this checkmate on f8. So let's say this, rook f7, and then you have to either give up the bishop by bishop g7, which also doesn't do much, or what, rook e6, but rook f8. So it's either giving a bishop or checkmate in a few moves. And now we have this position from the semifinals of Serbian Championship. This game is played between Luka Budisavljevic and Stefan Tadic. And here black is really passive and white has a bishop pair, but the nature of position gives black some hope that he can survive, even though he's so passive. And here white begins with h3. The reason for this move is that he wants to play at some moment g4 to challenge this pawn chain on the king side. And black tries to play queen c7 to force somehow f4. I think that his idea was just to provoke it to disable white from playing e4 at any moment. And white plays f4, but now things are not so simple, because after f4 the bishop can also come to play after bishop f3, bishop h5. Let's say if you play g4 at some point and black just keeps the structure intact by g6, you can take and somehow get the bishop to h5. So that's one threat that white has on his mind. And now black tries to activate his bishop by bishop a6, and now, like I said, g4 first. Now it's not so good to capture, because after this f5 becomes a very strong threat in the future. So black just kept this somewhat symmetrical with g6, and now queen e3. After which black played the knight f8. And here, if black went for queen c2, there is bishop f3. And actually this queen activity doesn't bring much to black. If you try knight f8, then king f2 next, and you might even have ideas like bishop d5 next. with some e6. That's some potential idea. If the knight goes back to d7, let's say, you might have bishop d5, and after this to go e6, and the e-pawn becomes a huge advantage, and also queen e5 as a potential resource is never bad to have. If black goes for knight b8, then there is this, and bishop h5. And with the bishop being so annoying on h5, bishop c5 can come, and some potential checkmating threats might appear. So black tried knight f8, and now bishop b6. White plays very concretely and goes for the a5 pawn. After which black plays queen c2, trying to do the same to the e2 pawn. And now white was too early to grab this pawn. Bishop a5. And in this position, bishop f3 was much better. First, keeping this e2 pawn alive, and what can black do here? He can do queen c3 in this position and try to create some counterplay. At least to have a passed pawn. After this, bishop a5, and to get d2 on the next move, or just to play d4. Just this, and have enough play. The knight comes into play, and knight c5 is coming, or knight b6. And black's position can be held, I think. So I think here king f2 is much better to play, and after this, and now it's not good to capture again because of d4, and this could still be a very complex position. Because the knight jumps to c5 on the next move, the c-pawn is there, and white cannot count on too much here. So after knight d7, white can go back to d4 actually. And if black doesn't exchange queens, he will be in too much trouble because of the before mentioned, let's say, queen c7, takes, and bishop h5. This looks really awful, and with queen g3 coming next, the king being so safe on f2, black's colleague on g8 is not so safe, and it's gonna have lots of issues. It can go queen g5, queen e7, and if the knight moves, there's also bishop c5 at some moment to deflect the queen. So I think the best option here would be to capture on e3, but then king e3 is possible, and even though this seems like a very solid endgame, like a very solid position, it's not like that. It seems like black's holding everything, but it's not like that. So what does black do here? If he goes king f7, then white takes gf and goes bishop h5. And you cannot go to g7 or g8 because of bishop e8, and the knight, who is a crucial piece for defending against bishop b6, has to go, and it doesn't bring black too much hope. So it has to go to e7, but now there is this, and actually black is going to be put in some kind of Zugzwang. After bishop b7, king d4, bishop a6, now just move your pawns up, king d8, and now even e3. And after a move like h6, there's bishop c5. And little by little, black is getting out of space. Bishop f7 is coming next, and it's not so easy to propose a good move to black. He can do this, actually. With the idea of this, knight c5 and targeting b3 pawn and keeping some equality. But actually here there is a brilliant move after bishop d3, and that's bishop b6. Putting the knight to a much worse square. Knight b6, king d3, and if the knight goes back to d7, there's king d4, and eventually you'll have this maneuver, and black has to allow king c5 at some point. So let's say I do this here, bishop b5, and if you move the knight, there's king c5, or first h5, let's say. Let's just stop every single hint of a counterplay and then go king c5. Also, the endgame like this is completely lost. After king c5, it's dead lost. So actually after, let's say, king e7, you can go here, knight d7, bishop e2, king d8, bishop b5, and after this, again, go for this, and with king c5 next, the knight is locked out completely, and the a5 pawn is going to be a victim of white's king. So actually this whole endgame in the end cannot hold. And that's why bishop f3 was much stronger than bishop a5, but in the game bishop a5 was played. And now queen d1 first. Black cannot exchange queens because that would just lead into the endgame with two passers on the queen side. So he chose this one, and now king h2. Here white doesn't go for king f2 because of d4. And the point is, after queen f3, to keep defending the pawn on e2, black has d3. And after capturing, there is queen b3, and the king is much weaker right now than black's king. And also these pawns are dropping as well, so black has some chances. So he chose this, and now black goes anyways for d4, queen f2 now, and queen takes b3. Now all these pawns are going to be exchanged, and it somehow makes black's life much easier, but still black has to be very careful, because after this was the critical moment in the game, and black took on a4 here, and the better choice was, before capturing on a4, to capture like this. Now this is a good choice, because after this, queen a4, bishop b4, and now queen d6 is a strong threat, targeting both knight on f8 and bishop on a6. But after bishop takes e2, queen d6, queen e8, let's say bishop c6, queen f7, black has some counterplay against the f pawn, and his queen has enough breathing space in that case. And what happened in the game was something different. In the game, black took on a4 immediately, and now white plays bishop b4. And now there's no time for fg because of queen d6, attacking the knight and the bishop at the same time. And if you play g3, just take it and go bishop f3 after a check. And here, if knight d7, just take on e6 and go bishop d5. So after bishop b4, black took on e2, but now there is queen d6, hitting the knight, And the queen has to go back to e8. There's no other way, because if you go knight e7, I can take on e6 and the king is just so naked. So after this, queen e8 was played. Now bishop c6, queen f7, and black is so passive right now. And now white plays an excellent move. He plays g5, keeps all this closed. The king side is closed entirely, and there's no counterplay like in the previous line I showed with fg, hg, with the f pawn being attacked by the queen. Now it's all blocked and black is paralyzed completely. And now black tries with bishop c4, and now queen d8, improving the position of his queen and also pinning the knight on the 8th rank. Now black is paralyzed and he cannot do much. He plays bishop b3, but now bishop e7, even more choking black's pieces with this move. Bishop c4, and now the king starts marching. King g3, bishop a2, and now the king walk. Now we have this king walk, and after queen g7, king d6 was played, and the point of this move is to defend the bishop one more time, so the queen can be free. And the final goal of this operation, of this king walk, is to trap the queen on g7 by putting bishops on f6 and e8 and covering all these squares, not to allow any kind of queen check, queen escape. So black just does what he can do. He goes bishop c4. Now h4, one not so important move. Queen f7, and now queen b8. Bishop a6 and queen a8. Trying to kick this knight, to kick this bishop from a6, because in case of some bishop e8, bishop f6, to not have queen b7. And when the bishop moves to c4, to have bishop e8, queen g7, and bishop f6. And now there's no place for the queen. The queen is trapped, and that's basically it. Without the bishop on a6, there's no queen b7, and that's game over. So that's it. That's why black resigned in this position after queen a8, because there was just no way to escape. Thank you so much for watching this, and if you got any questions, let me know in the comment section, and I'm answering, like always. See you soon, and bye-bye.